All right, we're back with the closing of the American frontier, looking at the American West in the last part of the 19th century. The first section we'll look at is the subjugation of native peoples on the western frontier into reservations, complete reservations. And then we'll take a look in chapter 41 at some of the myths that we associate with the West, including mining towns and cowboys and that sort of thing. Um, let's start off though with looking at culture. Okay, one thing to keep in mind is that the culture of the East, the American East, really does not resemble that of the American West whatsoever. The occupations of both sides of the country by the late part of the 19th century are completely different. The occupations that those who are living in the West do are these three: homestead farmers, miners, and cattle ranchers. And none of these require cities. So cities do not spring up very quickly at all in the West. Not really until we see major kind of cattle hubs. And then, which are going to be like in Abilene and Wichita and those sorts of areas, which really are generated by the railroad. And, later bigger cities like Salt Lake City or Denver will take mining interests to flourish, and or in Salt Lake City's case is founded by religious outcasts. But anyway, we start to see these two different narratives of the Eastern United States and the Western United States kind of emerge in this time period, and they kind of continue today. Now, what's driving massive population growth towards the West and conflict really between Native Americans and whites is a transcontinental railroad. All of a sudden, instead of having to get on a wagon and travel literally months out west and face exposure, disease, potential raids from Native Americans, now Americans can go on trains, right? Pretty comfortably, cheaply, and quickly. So getting out to the west is not going to be anywhere near as big of a problem. And that's what really is going to be driving this migration as we start to see Americans moving en masse by the millions into the West. We start to see also with that conflict with Native Americans. The first battle is going to be the Battle of Sand Creek, or we'll actually call it the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864, and then the Battle of Wounded Knee. Also could call that a massacre in 1890. And it's during this 26-year time period. This is the time we really do associate with cowboy and Indian myths, right? This is where we get the names like Geronimo, Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull, Chief Joseph, Red Cloud, and it's true. There is many battles. There's unbelievable atrocities committed on both sides. But this is really the end of the line for Native Americans as they're defeated eventually in battle, and finally, by 1890, at Wounded Knee, we start to see that all Native Americans are subjugated and put into reservations by the American military. Also, we want to keep in mind that technology and disease are driving this death and the dissemination for Native Americans. Technology, including rifles, the Gatling gun, being able to supply armies through railroads and industry. All those things are really helping the U.S. military to make sure that Native Americans will not have a chance to form any sort of large spread resistance at all. The biggest killer, of course, is disease. And this is a pretty alarming statistic from your textbook. For every one Indian killed with a bullet, 1,000 are going to die from disease, right? So, don't think the majority of death out west during this time period is happening in these fights between, quote, cowboys and Indians. It really isn't cowboys and Indians. It's mostly the U.S. military and Indians. The biggest killer is still going to be disease. Now, the first major battle that we're going to see out west after the Civil War, it's actually during the Civil War, is going to be at Sand Creek, okay? And the massacre at Sand Creek is truly kind of the opening for an incredibly violent and brutal treatment from white Americans towards natives. Not that this is anything necessarily super new, but it does seem to be a little bit eyebrow-raising as late as the 19th century. There's a village in southeast Colorado known as Sand Creek, and what happens on November 29th, 1864, John Chivington, who was a leader of a group of Colorado volunteers, attacks Black Kettle all right, the local chief of the Cheyenne Indians, who's trying to actually get the U.S. Army to protect his people and try to make truce. Chivington ignores the truce, and as a result, attacks on November 29th, killing 400 people, mostly women and children. This is unprovoked. There's no reason for this to happen whatsoever, and yet we see a massacre of Native Americans trying to work inside of the system of U.S. politics. Native American groups do seek revenge. Red Cloud is one of these leaders. He's a leader of Sioux troops, so not the Cheyennes. What he does is he attacks a bunch of whites, killing enormous amount of white people over at the Bozeman Trail. He killed 81 soldiers, right, on the Bozeman Trail of Montana. So even pretty far away, the retribution of Native American violence is going to continue kind of widespread. 1868, we get a treaty, the Treaty of Fort Laramie, that temporarily ends hostilities and tries to reaffirm the land boundaries of the Sioux and Cheyenne. But in the long run, as we know, nothing really changes. Now, we want to also talk about why American troops are behaving so crazily with Native Americans. We see this incredible brutality, mass scalpings, disembowelments, shooting of infants that are pleading for mercy. Why is this happening, right? Why are whites behaving in this way? And, a lot of it has to come down to fear or the use of intimidation, right? They're trying to scare Native Americans maybe into not bothering to fight, or they're mirroring the treatment of what they perceive the Native Americans would do for them. So there's kind of this eye for an eye mentality, at the same time showing Native Americans that they will, I guess you could say, meet force with force, and engage in acts of warfare, regardless of what the U.S. government is saying. The next major episode out west is going to be at Bighorn, the Battle of Little Bighorn. And here, with this, we get the famous Custer's Last Stand. Here's Colonel Custer here. And Custer is kind of a flamboyant general, fought in the Civil War. And his mission out west is to locate some scientific specimens and exploration. In 1874, he discovers gold in the Black Hills. The Black Hills are an area in South Dakota, so this is well north, okay? And after discovering gold, all right, there's of course another massive push for migration out to South Dakota, which really should be Native American territory. Now, Black Hills is actually a national forest, national park today. All right, there are Indian reservations adjacent to it. But what happens during this time period is a whole bunch of white settlement that shouldn't have been there in South Dakota. Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse are two local Sioux leaders, right, who want to defend this territory, and they end up crushing Custer at the Battle of Little Bighorn. Okay, the reason why this happens is because Custer basically finds the encampment, all right, the Sioux encampment, and he was only supposed to locate it and then wait for reinforcements to attack it, but he doesn't. He's flamboyant, he's brash, he ends up attacking the whole thing, and he loses literally the entirety of the 7th Cavalry, okay? Now, you might be thinking this is an incredible win for the Sioux, and maybe it would spell the end of U.S. military involvement in this area. That's not what happened. The Sioux are going to be chased by these, quote, reinforcements. It ends up with Sitting Bull's surrender. Crazy Horse has to flee to Canada, but will end up coming back and surrendering as well because he's starving to death. So, this is not a huge long-term victory for Native Americans in the West. If anything, it shows just the wave of force that the U.S. military is able to continue to throw at Native American communities, even as they are, winning, so to speak. Now, the American public is not going to be very sympathetic with Native Americans at all. Most are indifferent. Most actually call openly for the U.S. government to put down warring tribes, and only really a handful are going to criticize it at all. One of these is Helen Hunt Jackson, who writes a book known as A Century of Dishonor. And in this book, she criticizes the U.S. treatment of Native Americans. This is way ahead of its time, right? I mean, this is not getting big traction whatsoever inside of the American public. Also, another thing that we need to talk about is a decimation of buffalo herds. Buffalo were a major, not only a food staple, but clothing staple, tool staple for Sioux, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and other groups, Comanches. They were living in the open prairie, right? And what happens through hunting for sport, literally machine gunning buffalo herds, um, you know, by the millions, is the herds go from about 15 million down to just a few hundred. I think if you look at the crash course video for this section, I think it said that the Smithsonian could only find 25 good specimens, right? So, the Sioux loses their entire means of life, their subsistence existence. That's actually hard to say, subsistence existence, and they have to basically learn how to cope with farming a plot of land, which is not easy in the plains, or moving, right? So the buffalo herds are completely decimated, and just to kind of fuel a fashion trend or hunting trend for white Americans. Now I'm gonna take a little break here. So I've noticed that some people are not watching these videos, so I'm going to throw up a random fruit, and we're gonna have a little quiz in class the day these are due, and I'm going to ask you what fruit I pulled up, and it's an avocado, which is an amazing fruit. My daughter calls it aguga. Somehow she throws a G in there, but anyway, that will be a quiz question. What fruit did I pull up in my video lecture? It's an avocado. From South Central Mexico, which is pretty cool. So much cheaper in California. So much cheaper. All right, back to guided notes. Now, other conflict in the 1880s. Okay, in the 1880s, we have the passage of what is known as the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act opened land in Oklahoma to homesteaders, okay, which are people who want to go and make a homestead, which is basically a farm. Some 2 million acres in that area are opened up. It's supposed to be for Native Americans, right? But it's not. And what we see is the influx of Oklahomians, known as Sooners, okay, because they want to get there sooner than others, all right, to take up territory that is really Native American by right, okay? There's not a violence shed during this onslaught. By 1889, Native American tribes are almost completely subdued. Actually, they're all of them really are subdued, and all this territory that's supposed to be saved for Native Americans is, Oklahoma Territory was supposed to be the land, Indian Territory in perpetuity. So Native Americans inside of Oklahoma have to kind of just deal with this. Now, other tribes that we need to talk about are the Nez Perce and the Apaches. Okay, Nez Perce are going to be in Idaho. Gold is going to be discovered on their lands in 1877. Once again, it's going to be pushed off. The leader of the Nez Perce was Chief Joseph, and he decides he's going to just take his people to Canada and join forces with Sitting Bull. He is chased all the way through the mountain west into Canada, 1,700 miles. He's finally captured, and his tribe and him are going to be sent to Oklahoma. Half of them end up dying. The Apache is one of the fiercest groups inside of America. These in the American Southwest. Geronimo is a leader, once again chased through Texas, Arizona, and Mexico. Finally, through starvation, he's captured and ends up getting sent to Florida. So, two major groups of Indian resistance are defeated, okay? And this is really it. These two last groups are really the last groups to really fight against the American military. Native Americans are, and they're kind of forced to go onto reservations, end up having to farm, like I mentioned, land unsuitable for agriculture. They don't know how to irrigate. They have to deal with hostile tribes, and then of course alcoholism and poverty are widespread, and they still are today. And through the Dawes Act, it was a legislative ploy to try and get Native Americans to be Americanized, right? And to adopt white man education. So they resisted. The Dawes Act is created to school Native Americans, making sure that they stay farmers. They do get 160 acres of land. Teach them to speak English. They change their names, and this really leads to widespread tribal divisions and more destitution and loss of land. So, any sort of interference by the U.S. government with Native Americans at this time is going to be seen poorly, and it really goes over very, very poorly with the Dawes Act and the Homestead Act. Last thing we need to talk about is the ghost dance. The ghost dance is a Native American ritual, a form of resistant Native American spirituality, and basically it was a dance movement, a spiritual movement that foretold the end of the white man in America and the return of the buffalo herds. And really it was just kind of an allegory for the lost cause of Native Americans. It was started by a tribesman named Wovoka. All right, he does preach nonviolence, so he's not, calling for armed resistance, but he is getting a vision that, God is going to return this land back to Native Americans. Now, the ghost dance is not viewed as a nonviolent resistance movement. In fact, it's viewed with fear and hostility, right? Because white Americans can't necessarily understand this. So, what happens is the U.S. government makes the Sioux give up their weapons as a result of the fear of uprising. All right, and basically, what happens, as the U.S. government is trying to get the Sioux to relocate to Pine Ridge Reservation and demanding all the Sioux weapons, there's a confrontation at Wounded Knee. A shot rings out from a deaf Indian, and it leads to the massacre of 300 men, women, and children. Okay, and this is it. This is the last showdown between Native Americans and U.S. military, and all natives are officially subdued. So that's it. Really, the last armed conflict between the U.S. military and any sort of Native American group happens in 1890 with a massacre. There's a book about this, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, and this will actually be a second quiz question that I will ask you. So what book did I pull up in my video lecture? And it's going to be Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. This is written in 1970 by D. Brown. It's unbelievable. It's very, very critical of American policy toward Native Americans. Is really the inheritance of Helen Hunt Jackson. So something you would definitely want to read. I read this in high school and was blown away by the brazenness of American policy towards Native Americans. All right, that's going to be it for chapter 40. I'm going to end the lecture here, and then I'll upload another one for chapter 41.